What is Docker Swarm and why should you start using it inside of your Proxmox cluster? Let's go ahead and get started here. Think of Docker Swarm as a diet version of Kubernetes, or rather think of Kubernetes as a version of Docker Swarm that's on steroids. They're functionally, they aim to do the same thing. How they achieve those goals and how well they achieve those goals are two different things. What's interesting is that Kubernetes, when it first started, actually used Docker engine as its container engine, but over time it would split off and create its own thing, whereas Docker would kind of split off and create its own version of Kubernetes with Docker Swarm. Convergent evolution in technology is interesting. Or I guess this isn't even convergent evolution. One's a descendant of the other. So, yeah. In my last video, I walked you through setting up Portainer and Docker and explained some of the benefits of why you would want to do that on a Proxmox node. I explained how Docker could be used as a very easy and convenient way to get different services that you might want running in your home lab spun up for testing purposes or for personal use. The sales pitch is more or less the same when it comes to Docker Swarm, right? It's Docker, but with clustering, basically. The main thing I wanted to point out is that if you were to set this up, there were some things you should keep in mind. One, if you set up a Docker Swarm and you would like your nodes to have persistent storage, you're going to need some type of other storage solution. You're going to need NFS. You're going to need a iSCSI mount. Uh, you're going to need GlueSRFS or CIFS. Basically, you'll need a way for you to do shared storage for your containers. Something you should also note in the diagram to my left is that in order to get this set up, we're going to need 4 servers. When it comes to Docker Swarm, you're going to need at least 1 manager node and 1 worker node. To have a properly working swarm, you would want 1 manager node and 1 worker node on each of your Proxmox nodes, like below. Notice how we have 1 manager and 1 worker on each individual Proxmox node here. Something you should also keep in mind is that we will need a NFS server. That is that shared storage portion I mentioned earlier. The NFS server so that your Docker containers can have persistent storage. If you leave your Docker containers configured without persistent storage in a Docker Swarm, when your containers move from one node to another, your data will not move with it. So you set up persistent storage to kind of work around that. However, there were some problems I ran into while testing. And after doing some research, it seems those problems are just something you got to deal with. The joys of open source software. At least it's free. At least I'm not dealing with problems and then I got to pay Microsoft or somebody else to build a bill later. In my Proxmox environment, you can kind of see the representation of this map right here, where I have master 2 and worker 2 over here, as well as master 1 and worker 1 over here on my 2 different Proxmox nodes. So recall, to really take advantage of Docker Swarm on Proxmox, you would need at least 1 manager node and 1 worker node per Proxmox host. And you'll also need at least 1 NFS server. This server can be virtualized or an actual physical server. I would suggest a physical server just for performance issues when it comes to read and writes. Now let's go ahead and talk about the actual Proxmox deployment and why I think you should deploy this. On my Proxmox host, I have 4 virtual machines. Well, I have 5 virtual machines. I have a Docker Swarm 1 Master 1, Docker Swarm 1 Worker 1, Docker Swarm 1 Master 2, and Docker Swarm 1 Worker 2. All of these have a shared storage of Docker Swarm 1 NFS, and this is just a OMV, file server I have spun up and running to share out the NFS share. By setting up your virtual machines that way, you get a lot of benefits, and the first is more redundant high availability. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at our Proxmox host. And if you notice, when I go to HA, what you can do is add one of these. Let's add our Docker Swarm worker. And we can make this virtual machine highly available, Docker Swarm 1. Ensure replication is enabled on this virtual machine. Now, if we were to have a fail of our physical hardware, in other words, our Proxmox host, this Docker Swarm 1 should automatically fail over to our other Proxmox host. But it gets deeper than that. Because these virtual machines are in a virtual swarm, basically, what that means is that we can make changes to our Docker swarm, as on this Portainer page. Click our swarm and click stacks, and all the containers we spin up inside of the swarm as a service should be highly available. So technically, we could lose an entire node or several of our Docker hosts, and we should still have our services running. This setup, it should be noted, does take more resources than just spinning up one single Docker virtual machine, or even spinning up LXCs or virtual machines, right? Because technically you're expanding out the amount of resources you need, but it's worth it because it gives you so much availability of your resources, assuming you needed that level of availability. If you were to set this up, I would highly suggest that you have at least 3 Proxmox nodes, at least 3 Docker manager hosts, and at least 3 Docker worker hosts, and minimum 1 NFS server. If you have these, you should be able to get things working no problem, right? If you have any questions about setting up Docker Swarm, let me know in the comment section down below. Expect a long form video where I teach you how to spin up Docker Swarm on Proxmox, as well as how to build out your first container inside of Docker Swarm, and maybe even do an NFS mount with Docker Swarm, assuming you have the NFS server ready to go. As always, if you enjoy this content, please hit the like button. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. Otherwise, stay blessed, boys. I'll see y'all next video.